If you want to know why things happen in the industry, this is one of those videos where you'll definitely learn. So, who does EA make games for? I mean, we know that they're all in live service to the point of barely really releasing like one single player game a year. We know they're endlessly monetizing their sports games within the de facto monopoly they've held in that genre for years. We know that they, of course, grind developers to dust inside the likes of Respawn to make sure that returns don't get outpaced by that pesky spending. But as we look at the fact that they've made a profit of $1.1 billion last year, how does it make sense that they also spent $2.5 billion on something completely unrelated to games? It won't be talked about much, it won't be cited as, a big reason why our games aren't as good anymore, or anything like that, but it is important because yes, they dropped $2.5 billion on something that's important to them, that's entirely about their reason for existing, but it isn't good for the developers and certainly isn't good for you. So last time we covered the EA cuts, they were 300 to 400 people with 100 coming from Respawn. And according to EA, they, quote, acted decisively, realigning resources, managing costs, and focusing on our biggest opportunities. Hell yeah, stonks. But of course, since those cuts, we can now take, a pretty darn good stab at why those happened specifically at Respawn. And that's really just one side to their recent earnings report. So, EA are projecting that between this year and last, Apex Legends is expected to generate 40% less revenue. That's a massive decline. The game is already, of course, on a downward trend, and considering that the team had walked back the monetization changes, yeah, that does make sense. That decline in expectations, that is. They simply don't have a way to get players to spend as much money. Now, at the last earnings call, EA confirmed that they would be working on a, quote, more meaningful update of Apex as a broad game experience. So, some sort of major thing is brewing, but to give it a chance, they probably need to wait till, say, after the next Battlefield launches. But Apex is only one part of the story today, though at least EA are being realistic about, their expectations. And it turns out that them being realistic about those expectations has allowed them to just barely scrape by. And in case you're out of the loop, sports had seen forecasts drop amid wider struggles, and those drops were far more in terms of revenue that they didn't expect to make than Apex alone. And of course, when the cuts happened, we knew that those cuts was basically them shaping their investor narrative, because they announced the cuts like a week before their earnings call. But of course now, that earnings call has happened, and I think it very much confirms what we expected. EA actually pulled it off. They turned their story around, but that's really in large part because they had already slashed their revenue forecasts. So, quarterly revenue, income, and bookings were all up, but year on year, the net bookings were down 1% to $7.3 billion. The revenue was down 1.3% to $7.4 billion, and the net income was down 8% to $1.1 billion. I'm sure the net income being down is the bit that will hurt the most. Now, put simply, right? EA scraped by, but it could have been quite a bit worse. As an example, Split Fiction performed nearly twice as well as they had expected. It hit 4 million sales. That contributed actually to the majority of their full game sales for the most recent quarter. Over in the land of The Sims, the re-releases of 1 and 2 did fairly well. They had some really well-selling DLC, so that bumped Sims net bookings up 30%, the highest ever, and somehow Dragon Age even got a compliment for contributing to full game sales. But where it's interesting is across the whole year, because full game sales hit $2 billion, that's up 1%. But as an example, if Split Fiction sold at expectation, say 2 million copies instead of 4, you would have been looking at a decline for the year. And speaking of declines, live services. Because across the full year, right, full games made them $2 billion, but live services made them $5.34 billion. With numbers like that, I think we all know that their priority will be live services. And 4 million sales of Split Fiction is cool, I guess, but that's only $200 million bucks. Live services were down by 2%. That's $106 million. So that tiny drop in live service basically cancels out Split Fiction, almost doubling its sales expectations. That just kind of shows you what's up here. Now, live services is overall 73% of their total net bookings. And that means, whenever we said that Dragon Age's underperformance was essentially irrelevant compared to sports declining, that's what we meant. Moving to the sports revenues, though, things are actually kind of interesting. Global football took $1 billion this quarter alone. It's a shitload of money. And to their credit, EA actually did say that this was driven entirely by the development teams in EA Sports FC, basically rebuilding the game to meet player expectations and feedback in January. What a shocking thing, if only that happened for Apex, eh? But what that did is it brought the spending back to double digits, right? And what had really been worrying, existentially so, is that spending growth had been declining. It hit the single digits. So with that being back to double, they will be happy. And the thing to take away from all of this, right, big picture, is that EA still just about missed what they made last year, even if it was within their financial projections that they had decreased. Now, they were never at risk of making a loss, but the line has to go up regardless. And despite literally breaking records in multiple business areas, well, EA are predicting they will make lots more next year. In fact, another $500 million in bookings. Yeah, they're saying the line's got to go up. And yet investors in the share price are still broadly at their average for last year. And that's not because they think that Skate, Battlefield, and I don't know, EA Sports phone apps will bring in cash. It's because EA actually just proved that their business models worked. It's just not in the way that you, the customer, would be thinking. Not at all. EA's chief financial officer started his statement on the call with the following summary, and because it's delightful, I'll quote it for you. Combined with sustained strength in American football beyond the end of the season and the breakout success of Split Fiction, we expanded margins, generating strong free cash flow, and returned over $1 billion to stockholders through our enhanced repurchase program and dividends. Now, in that statement, there's one bit that's the most important, and it's key to understanding how AAA game developers that are publicly traded like Electronic Arts think and work. It's literally their purpose. It's nothing to do with games, but it's everything to do with AAA game development. This will be a little bit dense, but trust me, it's the point of this video, and it's literally why you often feel like games are not properly reinvested into. In financial year 24 to 25, EA spent $2.5 billion on buying back less than 1% of the shares that they had previously issued to the market. Now, $1.3 billion of that was spent in just the last 3 months. And what I'm going to do is explain kind of why all of this works in a simple enough way. So, at the end of every quarter, Electronic Arts pays every shareholder a 19-cent dividend per share, and they've done this for the last 3 years. Now, to keep it simple, these are equally divided from a portion of EA's profit for the quarter, and they represent something important, and that thing is consistent and guaranteed value for money for investors. Even more so when EA will pay to take them from you on occasion. So, EA are spending billions of dollars each year on this, on these stock buybacks, buying them back from the public market so EA own, well, more of their own stock. And they do that rather than spending money on development or developer compensation because that's not really what the company's for. What the company's for is, of course, shareholder returns. Now, these stocks are traded on the market, and yes, there's the dividend side, but also by buying their shares back, EA decreases the supply, and this can help them maintain their price or push their stock price higher, and that does matter a lot for investors. You see, EA's what they call dividend yield is fairly small. It's 0.51% annualized. That is, of course, much lower than inflation. That's an awful way to earn money, and this means that the best way for EA to serve their shareholders is to push the price up, because that will increase the value of the assets that their shareholders hold. You know, those assets being the shares. Now, year on year, Electronic Arts are up 17%. And we can contrast this with other companies. As an example, Ubisoft. The last year of Ubisoft reporting has, in many ways, been about shareholders feeling cheated. That's why there's legal action. Investors feel that their investments aren't really worth it. They want better returns. They think the board's not making decisions in their best interest. And some, such as AJ Investments, they see a week embattled Ubisoft, and they maybe think they can swoop in, do some, shenanigans to jack up the price. Anyway, EA's investors, on the other hand, have consistently gotten the same thing, regardless of dips or problems. And literally, the purpose of this listed company is to generate money for its shareholders. And of course, to generate that money, they'll rake in profits. Those profits can then be distributed via dividend, but also they can show growth. And if there's a very high expectation of growth, then the market will see that shares in the company are worth more money, so people will buy more of them at a higher price. So the line will go up, as we often say. Now, this doesn't mean that the games EA makes are unimportant. They're not wholly unimportant. They are important. important. No good games, of course, means there's no profit to distribute. It means there's no expectation of growth to make the price go higher. But there's another part of this earnings call that shows the outcome is far more important than how these games are produced or why they are produced. And rather ironically, it comes from EA confirming that they have no plans to increase the price of their games. That may sound insane, I know, but don't worry, I'll explain. So one of the analysts on the call asked about the macro state of EA's business and how they plan to respond to competitors raising prices on AAA games. I mean, of course they asked that. They're investment analysts. CEO Andrew Wilson pulled an Andrew Wilson. He fluffily said absolutely nothing of substance. But then the CFO chimed in with about 10 words and said that they had no plans to raise prices as part of their next year guidance. Who knows, maybe the next Mass Effect will be $80 or $90. But this actually shouldn't be surprising. What games would EA actually charge $80 for? And I'm not saying that to just, jab at them. There's a deeper point here. Because going back to our Ubisoft comparison, this earnings call also highlights a huge difference between the two companies, and that difference is back catalog. Ubisoft consistently makes heaps of money from their back catalog. That's just people buying old Assassin's Creed games, which of course very often are updated to be 60 FPS and all that stuff in the modern consoles. EA don't really have that. In fact, their own catalog income was explicitly called out as being weak, and they said they expected it to be weak in the future. And you won't like the reason why. It's because EA are moving towards, and I'll quote them, a more focused slate anchored around massive online communities and select blockbuster storytelling investments. God, I love a blockbuster storytelling investment. I mean, it is pretty obvious, right? Why would anyone buy a sports game from 2 years ago? And when EA are only producing 1 or 2 other games per year, that doesn't really leave much else to be sold as a premium product. And as the difference between full game revenue and live service revenue shows, well, live service is simply far more important to them. They are actually making single-player games. They are making non-live service games. EA Originals is custom built to make sure that there's one every year. And they've clearly got, by now, a good enough relationship with Disney to lock down multiple Marvel and Star Wars projects. But that sort of thing is a luxury, not a necessity. They are select because they're risky in a way that consistently monetizing their live services is not. Because you can just make a new football every year and tweak how you do it, right? And much like Activision, the model they're building the business around is one where live services are supplemented by yearly box price costs. Of course, if they start putting that up to $80, I mean, Call of Duty can do that, but that would start to hurt their live service revenue. That's perhaps why the CFO said they're not going to do that $10 price increase. Now, what EA wants to prove as a business, after their wobble last quarter, is that they are sustainable and can deliver. Because they do need to deliver. Those games need to be good for them to get revenue. But as EA Sports FC's turnaround shows, that's not necessarily for the players, it's just a means to an end. That end being, hey, let's drop a few billion every year to buy back our stock and jack the price up to keep our shareholders happy. And of course, if you're a player, maybe Apex, maybe whatever it could be, you probably don't feel great that those billions upon billions of dollars, I mean, it's enough to make a GTA, that's going into those buybacks, rather than, say, reinvestment in new, interesting, creative things. Because there's how you get your business to where it is, and I think that's what's going on within EA. But now that it is where it is, it's about optimizing what it's got. It's about doubling down on the things that have worked, sports, and pretty much managing that to maximize the shareholder returns. And while in my opinion you could make a convincing argument that if you reinvest in new IP, new crazy shit, that, in 5 years you could have a radically better business, well, risk, predictability, dependable results, those are the things that I think the market cares about the most, and that means that's pretty much what EA are optimizing around. Show you're responsible, show you care about sustainability, and then have a fairly okay earnings call where you also get to talk about how you are putting more and more money into buying back your stock to keep that price nice and high. Because that's how the game is played, and that's it for this video. And if all this has you just lusting for more AAA shenanigans, I think you gotta check out this video next because, we're getting branded expansions now.